There's something sinister growing under Chernobyl. Did you know that you can take a tour of Chernobyl right now? If you plan ahead, it will cost you about $100. You'll be able to walk through the site of one of the worst nuclear meltdowns in human history. Your tour guide will take you through the exclusion zone, right up to the plant that still contains the ruins of the reactors that went up like radioactive fireworks back in the 1980s. As you stand in the shadow of the crumbling smokestacks, your guide will promise you everything about the tour is safe. That Chernobyl is completely, perfectly safe. That's a lie. Depending on how much the guide knows, it might be a deliberate lie or a lie of omission, but the thing you need to remember always is that Chernobyl is not safe, pacified, or even sleeping. Chernobyl is alive and it is becoming more dangerous by the day. I found out what's growing under the abandoned plant when I snuck away from my tour group a week ago. I never intended to go off the path when I first signed up for the Chernobyl tour. I was excited to see the hollowed-out buildings, the scorched concrete where all of the graphite rained down that night in April of '86. Maybe I could even find a little irradiated rock or pine cone or something to take home as a souvenir. Both the official website and my tour guide assured our group that we were safe from any fallout. While the area around the nuclear plant still crackled with radiation in places, it was generally low enough above the ground that risks were minimal if exposure was limited to a few hours. Again, quoting the tour guide there. She did seem trustworthy, though, as well as shockingly beautiful. Blonde and short with heavily accented English, Alina already had most of us charmed when she picked us up from Kiev along with our bus. There were 7 of us, including Alina and the driver. All 5 of us tourists were American. Alina gave us the basic history of Chernobyl and the nearby ghost town of Pripyat as our bus thumped along the road towards the exclusion zone. "That sounds scary, yes?" Alina asked, one blue eye winking like a wave against a beach. Do not be overly concerned by the term, exclusion zone. We do not exclude. It's only a name. In fact, there are nearly 200 residents living in the 2,600 square kilometers surrounding Chernobyl. The bus ride, though bumpy, was soothing. Between the hum of the old engine and Alina's history lesson, I found my eyes starting to droop. I was nearly asleep when I saw the boy standing at the side of the road. Something about him gave me a little jolt and made me sit up. The boy was shirtless, skinny, and maybe 13. He was staring at the bus as we drove by, eyes wide and green, startling green. His face was narrow and expressionless. It was like someone had put a mannequin in a field and scribbled over its eyes with an emerald Sharpie. But the boy wasn't a doll. His head tracked us as we passed. As he faded in the rear view, the child raised a hand stiffly, like he wanted to wave but couldn't quite remember how. The rest of the bus ride into the exclusion zone was uneventful. After about an hour, Alina switched from history to preparing us for the tour. This included going over her company's safety research and then teaching us the basics of both disaster mitigation and radiation survival skills. She didn't get too in-depth about the actual effects of radiation poisoning, but I'd done my Googling before flying over to Kiev, so I have to admit I was a little terrified when the bus pulled up at a large security gate. "Welcome to Chernobyl," Alina chirped. We didn't actually start with the nuclear plant itself when we got off the bus. Up first was a tour of Pripyat, the abandoned town that used to house the workers and families who lived around Chernobyl. Since most folks left in a hurry, walking through Pripyat was beyond eerie. It was as if the entire community was suspended in a moment of time, a limbo where the residents could return any moment. But the area wasn't perfectly preserved. The wilderness had started to reclaim Pripyat, vines and underbrush creeping up and over concrete. Everywhere around the town was forest and frontier and green upon green. It certainly didn't look like a land sick with radiation. If anything, the exclusion zone felt vividly alive. At one point, I was walking at the back of the group snapping pictures when I felt my boots sink into the ground. It was like stepping on a pillow covered in spider webs. I glanced down to find myself standing in a puddle of green moss. It was spongy and textured like a honeycomb, covered in a downy fiber almost like fine hair. The color looked strangely familiar to me, though I couldn't place it at the time. I wiggled my foot, and my boot pulled free with a pop. There was enough suction to the moss that I stumbled and cursed, not that anyone noticed, as absorbed as they were with Chernobyl and Alina. I continued on, spotting more patches of the moss on the ground. Not that anyone noticed, as absorbed as they were with Chernobyl and Alina. I continued on, spotting more patches of the moss on the ground, on the sides of buildings, even dripping down from overhanging roofs. Other than the moss, what surprised me the most about Pripyat was the graffiti. There wasn't much of it, but occasionally, we'd stumble past a wall or door with swirling marks that bled together into almost recognizable shapes. The paint or ink or whatever was used to draw the symbols was the same green as the moss. I stopped Alina when we passed one door that I was positive was marked with the shape of a key, larger than my hand. "Do you get a lot of folks sneaking in here to tag the walls?" I asked. Alina looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "I do not understand. What is tag?" "Graffiti. Paint. Like right here on the door." "The door looks clean to me. I do not see any paint," Alina shrugged. "Sorry. Maybe it's a shadow." I dropped it. Maybe it was just a shadow I saw. Or maybe the radiation was getting to me. Safety promises be damned. While all of Pripyat was a little unsettling, the derelict amusement park was downright chilling. Abandoned rides and decaying attractions stood like scavenged corpses in neat rows. The sun was out in full and the weather was fine, but I felt cold as we walked through the park. Here and there, I thought I saw darting movement between the shadows of the rides. Wildlife, I told myself. Through all of this, Alina went on and on about the, in my opinion, overly optimistic future of Chernobyl. The people would come back and the soil would heal, and the plant might even begin burning again one day, according to Alina. We were all leaving the park, getting ready to head over towards the nuclear plant when I spotted somebody watching us from the tree line. It was the boy from the roadside earlier. I was sure of it. Only something was different about the child. He seemed taller, standing in the shade of a burst of pines and spruce. His limbs were long and thin, his ribs observable even at a distance. I thought I could even see his green eyes peeking out from the shadows, but that was probably a trick of the early afternoon light. The boy seemed to be waving at me, gesturing me over. I looked around. Alina was distracted by the old couple from Nashville. The man was wearing a cowboy hat and kept pantomiming taking a shot. His wife was waving her arms back towards downtown Pripyat. The other two tourists were sitting in the shade of the decrepit Ferris wheel, its carriages still nearly canary yellow despite the years of ashen weather. I figured I could sneak away from the group easily enough. They probably wouldn't even notice I was gone for 10 or 15 minutes since everybody was taking a break. I'd catch hell from Alina if I disappeared for a while. More than likely. But when was I ever going to get another chance to interact with the Chernobyl local? One of the elusive 200. A picture with a native would be a much better souvenir than some radioactive rock that probably wouldn't even glow. I made my move while Alina was flipping through a guidebook, still swarmed by the elderly couple. The boy faded back into the forest before I reached the tree line, but there was a small deer trail I was able to follow. I noticed more moss on the trees I passed, either sticking to trunks or hanging down from branches. The trail led to an open clearing. There was nobody in sight. "Hello?" I shouted. Or, "Oh crap, what was Russian for hello? Hello, Ski?" No response. I took a step into the clearing and froze. A deer had emerged from the trees nearby and was staring at me with all 6 of its eyes. A swirling crown of interwoven antlers rose up from the animal's head, or heads. It was almost 2 heads, but one seemed sunken, half-formed, and sprouting from the shared neck like a tumor. Both the buck and I stood still regarding each other until a roar cracked the silence and set the animal running back into the forest. Something about the sound was nearly human, but far too loud, too primal. A A massive shadow was moving between the trees on the other side of the clearing. It was fast, too fast to follow, but clumsy. Whatever it was, the thing was big enough to shake the trees it bounced off of, and it was heading directly after the deer. I decided to head back to the tour group. When I turned around, however, there was something wrong with the trail. Most of it was gone, covered by bright green moss. I tried my best to navigate the quarter-mile or so back to the reactors, but kept getting turned around. The mossy trail led me to another clearing, this one with an overgrown cave in the middle. Everywhere around and above the cave opening was covered in the strange emerald fibers. The boy stood in the clearing. At least I think it was the boy. The figure was taller, limbs long and bent, but the face was identical down to the piercing eyes. That was the moment that I realized that the color of his eyes and the color of the moss was the same eerie green. The boy, or man, or whatever, was shirtless. I thought he was wearing green pants at first, but when I got closer, I saw that it was moss covering him from navel down to nearly his ankles. He was gesturing for me to follow him into the cave. "Absolutely not, strange moss man," I said, turning around to leave the clearing. There was another roar, startlingly close, and I decided to take my chances with the cave and the weirdo. The roar trailed off into what was unmistakably the sound of a human weeping. "Go, go, go," I whispered, scrambling after the man into the narrow opening. It was warm in the cave and brighter than I expected. Everything had a green tint, like sunlight filtered through a bottle. The moss was soft and uncomfortably smooth under my palms. I cursed when something on the ground cut my hand. When my blood hit the plant matter, it began to twitch. I crawled a little faster. The tunnel leading deeper into the cave eventually opened up into a wide, vaulted cavern. It was bright inside the room, a glow coming off of the moss that covered every inch of rock around us. Part of me wished it was darker. That way, I might not have seen the things buried in the moss. The cavern was full of people, dozens, maybe hundreds. They were jammed into the moss-like living ornaments. Some were even pressed into the ceiling. "What the hell?" I whispered. The man had stopped in front of me. He turned back, face blank, and that's when I realized the second horror of the cavern. The bodies in the moss were all different sizes, but each had the exact same face. The boy from the side of the street, the man from the clearing. There were hundreds of copies of this thing suspended all around me. The creature pointed to something on the floor of the cave, a green lump sticking above the moss. Feeling like I was trapped in some terrible dream, I walked towards the cluster. The top was open, and curled inside the moss was the skeleton of a child. The original boy, I guessed. The skeleton was wearing scraps of decayed clothing. He must have been lying in the cave for years, maybe decades. Thick, thorny vines threaded through the boy's ribs and spine and skull. "What is this?" My question was cut off when strong hands wrapped around my throat from behind. The strength was unbelievable, unavoidable. I barely had time to struggle before I blacked out. The last memory I have of the cave is watching the vines begin to stir and slither like a pit of snakes as I fell forward. I woke up to the sound of Alina cursing in Russian. I was back at Chernobyl, laying on the concrete in the shadow of a giant silo. The tour group was standing over me, all of their faces somewhere in the spectrum of concerned to confused. All except Alina, who was clearly torn between anger and terror. "Why did you wander off?" she asked. "The forest is dangerous. What were you thinking?" I sat up gingerly. There was a sudden flash of pain all along my arms and legs. I looked down and saw that my jeans and shirt were shredded in many places, the skin underneath raw and covered in small cuts. I thought of the vines and the long barbed thorns. "How did I get back here?" I asked. Alina threw up her hands and shrugged. Then she launched into a tirade about the danger I'd put myself in and the effect that me being hurt could have on the tour company and her personally. I wasn't listening after the first few words, I'd seen the man from the clearing standing at the tree line watching my group. Next to him was a new figure, bent over like an old man with deep green eyes and my face. It was me. Thank you for listening and delving into the dark with me. I would be so grateful if you please click the thumbs up, subscribe, and leave me a comment. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others, and thus our twisted little community will grow. All stories read on this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast apps. Links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.